Bruchem Aboyim, ich heiße Shane Baker von dem Jiddischen Kulturkongress. Welcome everybody, I'm Shane Baker, Director of the Congress for Jewish Culture. And I can't tell you what a joy it is to be celebrating today this new publication of Maia Evrona's translations into English of the poetry of Yoysef Kerler. We will hear readings in English from Maia of her new translations, which were published this fall by the White Goat Press of the Yiddish Book Center in Amherst in a facing page translation, and I'll give you a link to that here very shortly. To help you in following the poetry today, which we'll hear some of it in Yiddish, and then in English, we'll also hear from Yoysef Kerler's son, Dovber Kerler, also speaking about his father and his work. And here is a PDF of some of the materials relevant to today. I've just put into chat, and it will be available for you here shortly. Dovber Kerler, the Alice Cohn Professor of Yiddish at Indiana University, Bloomington.
Spoiler alert, I'll start in Yiddish, but unfortunately, because we want everybody to understand, it will be mostly in English, I believe. I hope to arrange for a special meeting entirely in Yiddish. I hope to arrange a special meeting about Yoysef Kerler's poetry, and I'll have something. But now it will be mostly in English. I will, however, say what I just said also in Yiddish. Ich hoffe sehr, teure Freunde. Einen größten Dank, die alle sind gekommen, befragt, alte Bekannte, und dachte, dass dort auch viele noch zwei Übersetzers, was hat mir übersetzt, Yoysef Kerler's Lieder für Evrona, für Maia Evrona, und das ist Eli Palevsky, und wie ist unser Haber von Chicago, der Professor von Physik. Dachte, ich habe ihn gesendet. Ich will euch alle bedanken, euch andere Freunde, was sind sicher gekommen, Herren, mehr wegen Kerler nach Jiddisch oder auf Englisch. Aber weil, und Yoys, seien da Menschen, wo sie wird sein, sehr schwer zu verstehen. Ich weiß schon nicht wegen etwas, wegen allzu viele, ist, weil mir umgehen, auf Englisch. Ich hoffe, dass Hashem, als Bekorf, noch jeder, es fällt euch 110 Jahre sind, Yoysef Kerler's Geburtstag, will ich einordnen, ein größer Zoom, mit einem größeren Programm, mit öfter an Abend in New York und Jerusalem, lekovet Yoysef Kerler's Poesie auf Yiddish. Okay, I'm sorry that I'll have to talk language I know least, but you'll have to bear with me. I hope you will understand my Chata Chadibur. My personal acoustics is not terribly good, but I'll try. Yoysef Kerler, in his time, was a very well-known, actually one of the leading Yiddish poets of his generation, and in general. He was also, sorry, is everything okay? There is something in Russian here. I think we may have been bumped.
By the Russians.
By the Russians.
Oh my God.
Yeah. It said that I was muted, but now it's not muted. Some kind of a Russian devil.
Tu peux rester comme ça, ou est-ce que tu veux le son?
Qu'est-ce que vous dites? What was it, French all of a sudden? Okay.
Let me tell this because let me tell him he probably doesn't understand how to mute himself. Monsieur qu'on a entendu en français, il faut que vous appuyez sur le petit micro qui est en.
Quel monsieur?
I'm sorry, can we please proceed with the meeting?
Le monsieur qui a parlé en français.
I'm looking who is not muted. Well, Isabel, we can hear, she just muted herself. Okay, I hope everybody else is. Okay. So, Yoysef Kerler, even though he was very prominent and he was held a hero, he was a hero, and even though his poetry is really brave poetry, and I wrote about it, and I understand that thanks to Maia, thanks to her effort and to her endeavor to translate and publish a selection of Yoysef Kerler's poetry of all periods of his life, I believe that I understand better what happened in the past and what the life story of my father, the creative story of his poetry, how it developed. But this is not. I will share with you some ideas, some things that I've noticed. But this is not the major thing. The major thing is we want to celebrate this magnificent collection of Yoysef Kerler's poems from all periods of his life. Okay, it's not totally representative, but it does represent all major periods of his life and some of his major genres. Selected, collected, translated, and published by Maia Evrona. And this is not something that my father would have taken for granted because he didn't expect to be remembered for very long. But it's really very lucky that somebody wanted to translate his poetry more than 20 years after his death. In a faraway country, because it's a different country. It's not like in Israel or even Russia, where he had more connections with, for a while, well-recognized Yiddish poet inside the Soviet Union, also among Russian reading public, not only Jewish, but Russian reading literary public. So that's amazing. I'm very happy for this achievement, and I would like to thank Maia and to congratulate her on an important achievement, I believe, also in her own work. And just to mention you that someone undertook to translate an entire collection of Yoysef Kerler's poetry into Ukrainian, something like 5 years ago. Some people say it's not a great translation, but still somebody translated an entire collection of poetry. I've never seen it like this from one language to another. A young girl who turned out a very interesting young intellectual of Poland turned to me asking for permission to translate. That goes back 10 years ago. To translate Kerler's poetry from Vorkuta, where he was imprisoned in the coal mines. And she got to my father's poetry through learning as much as she could through the internet about Vorkuta, where her father, nothing to do with Jewish matters, was imprisoned by Stalin. So she translated it from Russian. But then later she even learned some Yiddish, okay, in Warsaw. So there are many cases that Yoysef Kerler is remembered, cherished, and liked, and most importantly remembered, I think, is what really matters for a poet, because there are many good, some even great poets that get forgotten. Very few get rediscovered, right? We know in English literature there is such a case. But usually it all goes into nivets into no place, into nowhere. So my father was very philosophical in his old age, and I think his posthumous career is developing fine. Maybe I would like it to develop even more. I certainly would. Maybe I should actually invest more in it. I definitely should. But even without his son, who's quite a lazy guy, he's doing quite well. And I'm very, very happy. My part being mostly buying the copies. I have no rights. I got only 2 copies, 3 copies. So I buy my copies and share it with friends. But whoever wants to buy a copy, it's again, I cannot stand in the way. Now, what Maia did by making an overview, a presentation of different periods of Yoysef Kerler's life, is that I understood that there is a whole period in Joseph Kerler's poetry that we do not know about. And this is his first period. We don't even have his first poems. What we do have his war poems were included two poems which are fathoming the war, which was very popular trope in the Soviet Union at the time. Everybody was expecting war. Everybody was talking about war. It only so happened that everybody was surprised in that. But on the whole, everybody was preparing for the war already in 39 and 40. So it's two poems from 1940s. All others are his poems from the front. We'll read one of them, I think. From the battle, he was a very courageous soldier. He was nearly mortally wounded in his mouth. Got a very important medal for bravery for this, for what he did, before he was wounded. He basically took over from his officer who was killed and directed the battle. And then all I knew was the poems from the Gulag and the imprisonment. Turns out that there was a year before he was imprisoned. He was imprisoned on May 1950. And October 1948, everything started to shut down. In 1949 was a dead year. And it was, of course, there were no, people were afraid to talk to each other. I mean, former writers. There were no writers in Yiddish anymore. There were only former writers, either imprisoned or waiting to be imprisoned. I'm not sure he expected to be imprisoned, but because he was considered at the time to be the youngest, representative of the youngest generation, probably the youngest. He has a poem about it. It's called, They Say I'm the Youngest, Maia translated. He actually, throughout that year, wrote poems of what I call, I don't have the English word, reckoning maybe, Din v'cheshbon. He was deeply disappointed in the communist ideals and the Soviet ideals. Not the ideals as a communist, but in the Soviet rhetoric and in the Soviet, in the way Soviet Union was treating its people. So this is actual beginning is anti-Soviet poems before he was, of course, when he was in prison, he continued in a natural way. There were very few people who wrote in the Gulag in Yiddish. There were a few that claimed that they did, maybe they did, maybe they didn't, but Yoysef Kerler wrote a large body of poems, very much as Shmuel Halkin, by the way, one of the greatest Yiddish poets, was not that well known, and I hope young people like Maia will discover Shmuel Halkin and translate him as well. And then after he was released in mid-1955 for Vorkuta, and he managed to remember to write down most of his poems, including a long poem, which is called Poema in Yiddish, not a lied, but a poema. Mein Zeide Yosel Batchen, my grandfather, Yosel, the wedding jester. So as you can see, I'm not the second generation Limester. I'm already a third generation Limester. And he was traveling all over Soviet Union, wherever there were Jews, like Chernovitz, like Kishinev, Chernovitz of Bukovina, now Ukraine, Kishinev, Moldova, like Kiev. We'll read today maybe a poem that he wrote when he was in Kiev in 1949, right before he was arrested. And Vilna, of course. And I spoke to people that told me, people spoke to me and told me that they remembered how he appeared and read his poetry openly, but of course in private houses. And many people couldn't believe how brave he was. They thought he was either brave or crazy. He was really brave. So those are the three periods: the war poems, the pre-arrest year, which is very important, and there are many poems that he wrote then, and the post-war and post-Gulag poems, for which he was very famous, and we'll read some of them. And then there is the final period when he went to Israel, which is quite remarkable, because my father himself developed a theory. He's not the first one to develop this theory. I believe he was wrong, and he developed the theory that to write really good poetry, you have to suffer. So great pain creates great poetry. There may be something to it, but it doesn't apply to everybody. Some people are not productive with great pain, others are not geniuses with great pain, as people produce text. But it was for him an adjustment to come to Israel. And he used the image of Steigl and Zweigl. He would say, I am a poet as a bird. So it's one thing to be in a gilden, how to say Steigl? Kloof. How to say kloof?
Cage.
A
Bird
bird
cage.
cage. Yeah, being in a gilden cage. You may get good food, but you have to sing songs that the boss wants you to sing, the owner. But once on a branch, you may be hungry, but at least you can sing whatever you have on your heart. So this is a poem we'll read later on from Zweigl to Steigl, which actually gives the name to this volume that Maia selected. We got very lucky that English doesn't have diminutives. So you have to say bird's cage and thin branch. Because in Yiddish, like in Russian, Zweigl, Steigl, Ветка, Kletka, doesn't sound poetic enough to be a title of a book. But when it's not, there's something to be said about not having diminutives, important as they are. So sometimes we have to use something missing to get to get as a result something very positive for our purposes. So that was the story. And actually, like a number of people wrote that his creativity, his poetry, got even more refined. Although I'm not sure it's more refined. This is just a new quality of a free person. The life was not terribly easy in Israel, but compared to the Soviet Union and to what they had to endure, of course, that was the closest to Gan Eden that we could find, right? And with all the problems, and of course, being a Yiddish writer in Israel in the 70s was not so simple. Now it's simply impossible. But so nobody knows it. But then there was still some leadership. There was social context, not only a creative effort, but also social context for poetry and literature. And his literature got really amazing. He went into different places. At the same time, at the very end, he also wrote a few poems that he remembered, as well as revisited poems that he didn't even publish. He had it in his archive, and he dished them out, and he prepared them for print. We'll get there as well. So all in all, it's an amazing an amazing story of creative life of Joseph Kerler. And I'm really grateful that Maia managed to bring it to contemporary English poetry reader or poetry reader in English. It's not simple, it's not easy. Those are two very different types of poetries. The Yiddish poetry, with very few exceptions, or not, of course, depends from where the poet comes from. If he comes from Anglo-Saxon, there you are not. Yiddish poetry is very formal. The rhyme, the meter, even when the meter is broken, it's also important. It's very different feel, different way. And Maya found the right way to convey it, to make it both faithful to the original and also appealing to an English poetry reader. Made it good English poems, I believe. So I do not want to continue to talk too much, and there are many things I would like to tell you. I would like to ask Maya say a few words, and then we'll simply read, and I'll give some comments. Maybe Maya will give some comments to about 10 poems. They're very short, by the way, don't worry, that we prepared with Maya to present for you in the original as well as in translation. Maya.
Well, thank you, Dovber, for the introduction and for everyone for tuning in. And I was just thought that I would talk a little bit about how I became interested in Yoysef Kerler. It was actually when I was at the Vilna program, and Dovber was one of the professors, and I noticed that all his bios said that he was the son of Yoysef Kerler. So I read a bit about Yoysef Kerler, and it seemed like it was important that he was a Yiddish poet who had written poetry in the Gulag, and likely the only one who had later published that poetry. And it was because of this that I thought that I would translate a few poems. And what drew me to translating a whole collection was just that I found the quality of those poems to be very high. And as I was investigating the collection, the trajectory of Kerler originally seeming to identify as more of a Soviet poet. And then as he, as the events in the Soviet Union evolved to witness his evolution away from becoming away from being a Soviet poet to being identifying as more of a Jewish and then an Israeli poet. It was interesting. And then I've been very surprised, or not surprised, but it's been very interesting as I've worked on this project and brought it to publication, just how relevant it has been to current events from primarily the war in Ukraine, but there have also been other striking, what's the word? Striking ways that the poems have spoken to the events happening in the United States and around the world over the past 5 years, and again, just in the past few months with the war in Israel. It's been very striking to see how these poems continue to speak to the world that we live in today. Back to you, Dr. I think that you're muted.
Sorry. Okay. That maybe Shane wants to say something. You don't have to. Don't feel obliged.
I'm happy to hear poetry now. I said a little
Okay.
bit at the beginning, and that's enough from me.
Okay, I'm going to share. I'm going to share. Okay, I would ask Maia to read it in the translation, and I'll say a few words and I'll read it in Yiddish. You can see them both here.
Okay, and as you will probably be able to figure out from the context, from the content of this poem, it is a poem that he wrote on the front. I sit myself down at the blank sheet. Snow-covered fields spread out before me. And with the first letter scribed, the wind whistles and the frost starts to bite. Just as the stanza comes to a close, we crawl, pressed stiff to the ground, to the enemy's trenches. Here they are now, and someone is calling and somebody falls, and someone stifles their very last shout. Lines, like trickles of blood in the snow.
I'm not muted, right? I'm not muted. Yeah, this is one of the front poems. It's not about the battle itself, as you see. There's battle poems. There's also amazing poems of hallucinations and while being really heavily wounded. It's like he got out not only alive, but he was mainly functioning person, normally functioning. But this is a very quiet moment between the fighting. That's how it sounds in the original. Setzt sich zu bei dem Beugenpapier, spreiten sich Felder verschneite von mir. Und bei dem ersten verschriebenen Os pfeift schon der Wind und starrt sich der Frost. Gleich wie die Strophe geschlossen, nur wert. Poison mir zugedrückt, Poison mir zugedrückt, Herz zu der Erd. Dem Säunes Trancheen und seinen sie bald. Und Emetzer ruft schon, und Emetzer fällt, und Emetzer verschweigt schon das letzte Geschrei. Schures wie schnierlich Blut auf dem Schnee. He's not describing the battle. Remember, the battle comes to him when he sits down and writes, because what else can he be writing about in this situation, in these conditions? Okay, so the next poem is, people say that Gulag or jail is not exactly a place to write lyrical poetry. But he wrote some amazing lyrical poems, and this is one of them. And we will listen later on how Yoysef Kerler read it in the early 60s, about the time that he was traveling, and someone actually recorded them in Keshemet. So even his pronunciation of Yiddish was a bit different at the time. We'll listen to it. I have the recording. But let's see the poem in English.
Okay,
Maia.
I've been told that there is an echo when I'm speaking. Is the echo less before I read the poem?
There
Do
is
you
an
hear it?
echo?
Might be less.
Okay, we'll see. When my love goes to sleep. Sleep, my dearest, go to sleep. I will be rolling stones up peaks. I will be bearing chains alone. You should be happy though. My distant dearest, my distant sweet. Better that you not remember those days and nights in ember when we were full of pleasure. Sleep, my dearest, go to sleep. May you be cherished by your faithful lover. May you be his only fire, as once you were for only me. Over me, the borealis. Under me, the earth is darkness. Still my heart, no need to murmur. Sleep, my dearest, go to sleep. My distant dearest, my distant sweet.
And this is how you read it in the 1960s, early 1960s. I hope we can hear it.
Schlaft ein. Schlaf, mein Teire, schlaf ein. Kijken wel ich drogen einer schleppen Berg mit Steiner. Du wirst aber glücklich sein, weite meine. Schlaf, mein Teire, schlaf ein. Wohl sein, du sollst vergessen, jene strahlige Misslessen, wenn wir pflegen, glücklich sein. Weite meine. Schlaf, mein Teire, schlaf ein. Soll dich lieben, dein Getreier. Sein sollst du sein einzig Feier, wie du pflegst vor mir noch sein. Weite meine. Über mir die kalte Schein, unter mir die Erde in Heuschach. Still, mein Herz, mir darf nicht räuschen. Schlaf, mein Teire, schlaf ein. Weite meine.
Now you could also see that I gave the text, the final text that he published in 1971 in Yiddish. When it appeared in 1971, actually sent it to Israel in 1969 from Moscow. And he changed it, but you hear the echo as an echo, the original version as he wrote it. And it's actually It sounds like almost like a song. And Emil Gorovitz, the great popular singer of the Soviet Union, Emil Gorovitz, who's more or less unknown in America, unless you deal with Yiddish, maybe. He was his older brother. They were 9 children of a Jewish smith in my town where he was born. His oldest brother was his friend, and he looked up for my father in the early 60s or late 50s when my father was released already, freed, and asked him to help him to produce a program of Yiddish songs. And my father had to. He was an opera singer, then he was a pop singer. So then he went to America, and he had the Emil Gorovitz hour on one of those forwards radio programs. And he made a whole program about my father where he recorded himself singing this poem as a song. Not the best of recordings, but you can still hear something.
Keten wenn ich trugen einer, du sollst aber glücklich sein. Weite meine, weite meine. Schlaf, mein Teure, schlaf ein. Freuen wird sein, du sollst vergessen. Jene Strahle gemessen, wenn wir fliegen, glücklich sein. Weite meine, weite meine. Schlaf, mein Teure, schlaf ein. Soll dich lieben dein Getreuer, sein sollst du sein einzig Feuer, wie du pflegst, vor mir noch sein. Weite meine, weite meine. Schlaf, mein Teure, schlaf ein. Über mir die Sonnenschein, hinter mir der Erdenchoschen, still mein Herz, bedarf nicht räuschen. Weite meine, weite meine. Schlaf, mein Teure, schlaf ein. Berger auf Welkeit den Steiner, Keiten will ich trugen einer, du sollst aber glücklich sein. Weite meine, weite
Okay, we're going back. So this is this poem, and we don't have to read it because we heard the poet himself reading it with much younger voice. I was at the time about 2 years old, so that was some time ago. Now, this is one of those protest poems. I thought he wrote it in my time, but actually, according to the dating, it was written when he was still in Gulag in 1953. Many of you may have heard the name Lermontov. This is the second greatest Russian poet after Pushkin. And some people say that he would have been even greater than Pushkin had he lived at least a little bit more. Yeah, he was killed very early in a duel, very much like Pushkin. And many Russians are divided between Pushkin and Lermontov. Lermontov was much more romantic. Anyway, I'm not going to teach you how to tell you about the Russian poetry. What is important is the intertext of this poem. Lermontov has two stanzas where it says, "Goodbye, dirty Russia, unwashed Russia. Прощай, немытая Россия." And then it says, I'm going away from your people that wear the blue uniforms. This was the police then. And maybe the Caucasus, the mountains of Caucasus will save a poet from all the dangers of life in Russia. And those two stanzas, something like 10 years ago, about 10 years ago, maybe a bit more, a bit less, the Russian nationalists started to claim that Lermontov never wrote it. They couldn't find the original. And because it's not nice, such a great poet, right? Such a negative thing about Mother Russia. Anyway, my father didn't know about all this criticism because they appear after his death anyway. And this is a very famous poem that most Russians in my time, my generation, know it. Yoysef's poem is 5 stanzas, right? But it clearly uses both the rhythm, the meter, and the imagery. He refers directly to the poem, yeah? It goes like this. Прощай, немытая Россия, in blood und Flamm gescheiert. It's not exactly the same, but the text and the content actually provides you with all you need to know. Maia, please, can you read it, please?
Polished in blood and flame, washed in tears, God willing, you might, my sweet, someday be clean. The same fields mourn, the same heavens freeze, the same ears yearn, the same, the uniforms. And the eyes too bore in from every side, and the terror too lies in wait, any way you turn. But times, they say, do change. The skies are now in tatters. The distances are different, and different too, their measure. And the Caucasus can no longer help, with all their hills and crevices, a poet find his shelter from these ferocious police searches.
Here it sounds approximately the original. In Blut, in Flamm gescheierte, gewaschenen Tränen, gib Gott, du sollst mein Teiere amol hoch reinschen werden, dieselbe Felder treuern, dieselbe Himmeln frieren, dieselbe Schädne euren, dieselbe demondieren, und euch die Augen beuern von jeder Seite entgegen, und euch die Schrecken leuern auf alle deine Wegen. Nur Zeiten, sagt man, beiden sich, die Himmel schön zerschlossen, schön andere die Weitkeiten und andere die Mossen. Uns kann Kafkas nicht helfen schön, mit alle Berg und Spalten von die Ablaves, welfische Dichter euch behalten. Okay, sounds very Russian, but it's actually very Yiddish as well. Okay, this is this is the year after his release, about some month. This is where he uses the word Vigeland. It's very problematic. My father never claimed to have created new words, with one exception, and this is Vigeland. And he wasn't the one to steal either. He was actually sensitive if somebody used this imagery. You know, he would have noticed it. He wasn't mad, but he would have noticed it. You know? He claimed that he invented the word Vigeland, which means cradle land, the land of the cradle, instead of heimland, which is homeland, because he claimed that Russia is not his home anymore. Even Ukraine, if we come to Ukraine as well, he claimed that it's the place where his cradle was. Well, okay, so, and he loves this place as well as he has serious problems with it. We'll come to it later. But actually, the word Wigland existed before. In Polish Yiddish, it meant appearance, how you looks. Wigland, Wygled in Russian, Wygled, for those who don't know Russian. But that's a completely different word. And then around the 40s, I saw this together with my father using it. They actually started using it very early. I think even before the war, in the 40s. And this is the word that Leigh claimed, because he was not the kind of poet who invents words. He used to say, it was an important aspect of his poetry. No need to invent words. We have great words already, right? Others, of course, claim that the poetic vision is so great that they must invent new words. Okay. Maia, sehr, sehr gut.
Dear land of my cradle, farewell. I am leaving you, but not like a dog driven away, ready at a whistle or a treat to spring back, wagging its tail. I am leaving, stone certain. Every stride weighs 40 pounds. I tear away each step, tracking bits of earth mixed with my blood. I tear away my eyes. I tear away my heart, and I wish you well. Goodbye.
Yeah, this one also. I remember that I thought it was written in front of me, but it was actually written earlier, and it goes like this: Mein Teier Wigland, bleib gesund. Ich geh von dir weg, noch nicht wie kein gejockter Hund, was auf dem Pfeif zerverlegt, ist greit, springt noch zurück, dreht mit dem Heck. Ich geh ja weg, veraction schwer, es wird jeder Spann apud, kreis ob dem Trott, mit sticker Erd, vermischt mit mein Blut, kreis ob das Zeug, kreis ob das Herz, und Wünsch, soll sein dir gut. I wish we had it recorded how he read it, but okay. Sometime in 1971, we arrived in late March, and sometimes in late, maybe not so late. In April, there was a special afternoon reception at Zalman Shazar, the third president of Israel, in honor of my father. And Shazar spoke. He was a historian and an intellectual, also a bit of a poet himself, both in Hebrew and in Yiddish. And his wife was also a quite known intellectual, Rachel Shazar Nelson. And they both spoke beautifully about my father's poetry. And both of them noticed that my father's poems are quite short. Now, this is shorter than regular Kerler poem, but it's true. He mostly wrote shorter poems. And this is something that nobody studied, because in the 19th century, late 19th century, when Yiddish poetry started, people were writing very long poems, like not necessarily poem, like long poems, but they wrote cycles, and each cycle had, 7, 8, 9 stanzas of poems. So this is one of the shorter ones. Maia, says a good.
There is a certain kind of smile, a certain spark, a wink, a good intention. They unlock the deepest heights. They soften a stone on the road. The strongest cogwheels crumble, brushing against your gentle bones. Let go. I will wipe the blood from your mouth. You have been clenching your teeth too strong.
Says do as I'm in Schmeichel, a funk, a guter Mein, sie schließen auf die tiefste Hechen. Sie machen weich in Wege stehen. Die stärkste Zehnräder sich christeln, barieren dich dein Zartgebein. Los, ich will das Blut von Meul abwischen. Zu hart hast du verklemmt, die Zehn. Now, he came to the poem, which is both very positive and very negative. It's actually more negative than positive if you think about it. This is where he uses the word cradle, land, big land, but he also uses the word Stiefland. Stief is like stepbrother, stepmother, stepland, Stiefland. So we don't have the recording of the author reading it, but first let's read the English. And it's, you see, it's bitter. It's sweet and bitter, but it's more bitter. He says, I wish I could forget you. But then I have a present to all of you something that is not in the book. He rewrote this poem in a completely different way. Maia, please be so kind. Ukraine,
Ukraine, my cradle country. Ukraine, my love, my longing, age-old enmity. I want to cast you from my heart, toss you to the dogs. Why then can I still be bewitched by the kobza, as if it were David's heart? Quiet already, blind destiny. I beg you, I have my own anxiety. All these songs of Gonta would slice my throat. You are shackled and your chains beat my bones black and blue. But when you pull free for a while, your knife begins to sparkle. Ukraine, 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 my cradle land. Tender and gentle your blue sky above my dawn. I am far away from my Podolia, lost in the world, but your dense rye murmurs behind my back, and your quiet grass slakes my lips of thirst, as if I could forget it is, soaked with my own blood. Ukraine, Ukraine, oh sweet children, the love and longing, an age-old enmity. Ukraine, 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 my step country.
Ukraine, Wigland, Ukraine, Bänkschaft meine, Liebschaft meine, teures de Gezine, ich will dich ausflicken von Herzen, vor die Kloven werfen, Boże, kischaft mich die Kobse, gleich wie Davids Harfe, schweig schon, bete, blinde Dolle, hab sich meine Sorgen, die Gesangen wegen Gonten, Gonte will mein Gorgel, wirst verkauft in die Ketten, meine Beine dreschen, no befrei dich auf eine Weile, finkelt auf dein Messer. Ukraine, Wigland, Ukraine, mild und weich dein blauer Himmel über mein Beginnen. Weit bin ich von mein Podolie, in der Welt verloren, als räuscht hinter de Plätzes dein gedichter Korn, und löschen meine Lippen deine stille Großen, soll vergessen, wie sie seinen mit mein Blut begossen. Ukraine, oi, gesangen süße, soll meine Kindske de Bänkschaft meines Bissen, jo, de Bänkschaft und de Liebschaft und de teures de Kissine. Ukraine, Stiefland, Ukraine. So he ends with the Stiefland, but then in 1994, I think 1994, almost 30 years later, he rewrote this poem. It's a different Ukraine. He took out all the bitterness, all the bad stuff. It's just, is yearning for his cradle land. And we don't have a translation yet, but just listen to the music, or maybe you will understand even if you not totally Yiddish speaker. Es wird sich anfragen auf mir, mein Wiegland, mein Geborenland, mein Kindheit. Ich trage entgegen allem das Wunder, als Chotem mit der voller Brust. Und Gott zu danken, bin genug noch stark. Äußertens wird mein gesunder Kark die erste Liebschaft zu mein Zeugmutter Ukraine. Zeugmutter ist Nurse, wird Nurse. Ukraine, Wiegland, Ukraine, saftig blühen Felder, Grüne, bis zu mein Medine. Weit bin ich von mein Padolie in der Welt verloren. Nur se räuscht hinter der Plätze dein gedichter Korn. Und se kischert mich dein Kobse. Punkt wie David Zarfe. Ich kenn mein Jenke Ukraine sich mit dir nicht wahr. It's an amazing reworking of a poem. He uses some of the same words, the same imagery, but it's totally positive. Yeah, so this is one of the very first poems that he wrote in 1971. And it's this is the name of the collection, right? From bird's cage to thin branch, from Zweigel, from Steigel to Steigel to Zweigel.
And Dovber, I was going to ask, is there a reason you have this one ahead of Chanukah Eve?
I don't remember.
Or should we read the Chanukah one?
This
first?
Chanukah comes afterwards.
Okay, okay.
Okay, sorry
I will
about
start
that.
with this one.
You're right. Logically and chronologically, it should have come after the Chanukah Lied. Chanukah Lied is from Moscow.
Okay.
But this
we're going to read this one.
Cradle and Homeland, this is the difference between Steigel and Zweigel, between cage and branch.
Okay.
Yeah.
From cradle land to homeland, the incision still smarts. Who could think that song could be made up on the spot? The anointed syllables, in suffering purified, they're dripping like blood from divided light. They have clearly tasted fire on their tongues, from a bird's cage to a thin branch, my stuttering tribe. From birdcage to fragile branch, from fractures to essence, from fetters and from longing, to wings waving over the endless heavens of a small tender land that rests like a beating heart in your hand.
Von Wiegland zu Heimland tut wenig der Schnitt. Wer meint, das Gesang von der Arbel sich schütt? Der Silben gesalbte, geteufelt im Pein, sie triefen wie Blut von zerschnittener Schein. Sie haben doch Feier geprüft auf dem Tamm, von Steigel zum Zweigel, mein stammlender Stamm, von Steigel zum Zweigel, vom Bruch bis zum Toch. Von Pent und von Bänkschaft bis Fliegelgefoch, auf randlose Himmeln, von kleinigen Land, was liegt wie ein lebendig Herz auf dein Hand. And now we come to this poem, which is the longest one. I somehow managed to put them all in one page. Again, I don't know whether we have a dating, but I thought that was written in front of me, kind of. I remember him reading it. I think it was written in the 67 or something like that, 67, 66. And this is about Hanukkah. And it's like a time capsule because he uses the word Shabbos Goy. And we know Shabbos Goy doesn't fulfill this function. This is not a function of Shabbos Goy to take out light before a holiday. And certainly Hanukkah, they don't need the Shabbos Goy. But somehow it sounded very Jewish. It was both Jewish and also oxymoronic, because Shabbos Goy, they have Shabbos Eid, but Shabbos Goy, of course, it's a tradition, a certain function that non-Jews can do to help Jews to keep Shabbos. But the Shabbos Goy is here has nothing to do with the actual ritual, but it has to do with the feeling of mis-Judaism, of mis-Jewishness. Okay, so that's the idea. You'll see from the poem, it's very simple. Maia, very good.
Hanukkah Eve. Today, on the first night of Hanukkah, to myself I say, first complete the holy service of a simple Shabbos Goy. Today, one by one I slake the calling flames of beckoning city, of precious place. A breath blows out the palm trees of Palermo and the embroidered marble castles of the Venetian canals flicker out like so, and the breath stills the ripples of the sun. Paris sinks into darkness with all her gloried boulevards, squares, brothels, monuments. A breath, and golden Prague flickers out. The synagogues of the old city, circled by Gothic churches. The Prado of Madrid vanishes. May my hand wither twice over, sweet God, if you ever find me there. And now onto the last bit of flickering flame. Together with my age-old pain, I extinguish the Greek Acropolis. I extinguish the Roman Colosseum. And also the beaming ruby stars. Though I have already allowed my hands to fall, I blow them out. And paler, paler, paler grow these looming blood red walls. And only the Valdai bells are still ringing sadly somewhere, accompanying the last pyres, engulfed by the white distance. And that is all. Now I light the first candle of the 8, which with all my might I will bless tonight.
He explained the Shabbos Goy, but also some of the lights is taking out, not necessarily immediately understandable. He speaks about beaming ruby stars. Those are the ruby stars of the Kremlin, of course, and and the red walls are also the red walls of the Kremlin walls. Valdai, there was there's some stories, some legend about people in Valdai being able produce the best bells in all of Russia and all of the world. Some ridiculous stuff. Today, Valdai is actually has a very bad name. This is a place where Putin likes to go and has his pompous meetings with the people. It's a resort place, I guess, of sorts. So instead of me reading it, I'll let you listen to me reading it as recorded, because it so happened that the recording is better. Okay. Erev Chaneke von Yoysef Kerler, angeschrieben upon in 1968 mit 50 Jahren zurück. Erev Chaneke. Heint, Erev Chaneke, ich sag zu sich azoi, zuerst gewolton die heilige Avoide von a Prosten Shabbos Goy. Heint chlesch einzig weiß der rufendicke Feiern, von reizendicke Städt, von Plätzer, Teire. Ablos uns läschen sich die Palmen von Palermo, und mirmel ausgehefte Schlösser in die Kanalen von Venedig sich verläschen. Ablos uns gliedern in Seine-Teich die Wellen, es versinkt im Finsternis Paris mit alle ihre rumpfele Boulevarden, Plätzer, Denkmäler, Bordellen. Ablos uns wird verloschen Zlata Praga, die Klois von Altstadt in dem Kreis von Kloisters Gotische, es verschwindt Madrider Prado, was obdern soll zweimal mir die Hand, ob ich will hinzukommen, Gotenju. Und bis zum letzten Flemmeltropfen, zusammen mit mein teures dicken Weh, Chlescheus dem griechischen Akropol, verläsch dem Räumer Kolisei, und euch die Strahle Cherubinen Stern, chotsch losen sich dabei erob die Hand, verläsch, und blasser, blasser, blasser werden die neunte, die blutig reute Wend, und bloß die gleckerlich Waldeier, noch ergens wo verrummert klingen, begleitendig dem letzten Scheiterfeier, was weiße Weitkeiten verschlingen, und als a Zindon das erste Lichtel von die Acht, was fortig Menschen welch heint vernacht. Now, how do I kill it? Okay. Okay. Of course, my father was quite familiar with the avant-garde and the experiments in poetry, both in Russia, and Russia was in the forefront by the 1920s. Futurism was developed and expressionism, stuff like that. But there was a little bit of a clash between poets that came from the Soviet Union and Western poets who first of all, they accused the poets from the Soviet Union of being social realists. Nobody knew what social realists by the time anyway, but it was a convenient thing to accuse people in. And secondly, they are not experimenting. They're writing with rhyme and reason as Pushkin used to write, as if it was something very bad. And this poem is a reply, of course, this is the context, and I know it, I can convey it to you, but it's a poem in its own right. But this poem is that you don't, it's like something I said about minting new words. You don't need new words. You don't need new forms. I'm old-fashioned. I see things as they are. And this is one of those poems. Maia,
we no longer have the PDF. If people want to read along, I can read it without it, but I think it's nice.
For some reason, my sharing disappeared.
There we go. Old-fashioned. I am old-fashioned like the great sky that shines forth after a sudden storm, with smiling compassion for the satellites, storming over its infinite heart. I am old-fashioned like the thinnest blade of grass that breaks through and grows green in asphalt, that withers and shrivels and again recovers with every drop of rain that falls. I am just as old-fashioned as the newly born, and as the murdered Jews of my generation were. They, who in memory become ever younger, the angrier the frost grows through my hair. I am old-fashioned.
Yes. Altmodisch bin ich wie der größer Himmel. Was lichtig sich von Wolkenbruch heraus mit schmeichelndicke Mitleid zum Gewimmel von Satelliten auf sein einsafiger Scheuß. Altmodisch bin ich wie das minste Gräsel, was piekt sich durch und grinnt bei dem Asphalt, was dart und quad und wieder wird genesen mit jeder Tropfen, was von Himmel fällt. Altmodisch bin ich gleich wie erst geboren, und wie gewähnt seinen die Gedeutschen von mein Dor, was singern als mehr sich in sie korn, was beisers wird der Frost auf meine Ohr. Altmodisch bin ich. Okay, uh, can I share my stuff? Because, okay. Okay, sharing. And we're going back to... Okay, and almost final. Huh? We have 2 more poems after this one. As you see, they're very short. This is the sea. This is just, poets write about the sea. They see the sea, they write about the sea. So this is one of those poems. It's very, very mild. It also deals with the time because it's post Yom Kippur War or Day of Atonement War. So it must be sometime late 70s, early 80s. And you see there is drunk on blood and oil, right? And then it deals with the entire creation, So it talks about God creating it. That sea just came out of creation. Maia, there's a good, please read it for us in English.
The sea. Today, the sea has a mother's gentleness. It surrounds you and rocks you to sleep with good old-fashioned lullabies that now seldom return to our dazed century, drunk on blood and oil. Today, the sea is still and bewildered, as if just emerged from creation, from between those divine fingertips, from which the dew still drips, and bright rings are multiplying over the blue just born.
Der Jam geseint mild wie a Mame. Nimmt dich herum und verwiegt mit gute altmodische Grammen, was kommen schon selten zurück zu unser zerdulten Jahrhundert, verschickert von Blut und von Nacht. Der Jam ist ein Stiel und verwundert, wie da was heraus von was Schaf und zwischen die göttlichen Finger, von welches trifft noch der Toi, und werden sich sonnige Ringen auf Norwes geborener Loi. Okay, so those are the poems that we collected, and Maya also asked to read Babi Yar, which my father wrote in 1949, I guess. Yeah, it says here, yeah? And only 91 he published it. So...
At Babi Yar. Don't remain here, brother, face to face with only yourself, lest tears gush forth from all those who, before death, had no tears to shed. Brother, toward people you should go, into the thicket of the human whirlpool. Then, at least one person among thousands will perhaps hear the strangled weeping of mothers and of children when the grass was bathed in fresh dew, those prayers that never reached the heavens, which at that moment shone so gentle and so blue.
Well, those are the famous lines by Bialik, very similar. I simply don't know whether my father was aware of it. Or maybe it came somehow to him. But the, the, the sun shining and the angel of death killing. Verbleib nicht, Bruder, euer Volk mit sich allein, was kennt von dir erspart an das Gewehen, von alle die, was haben von Teut Kindern nicht gehabt. Zu Menschen, Bruder, sollst du gehen, in der Gedichtenis von menschlichen Gewimmel, öfter kurz zu einem zwischen 1000 wird er gehen, von Mamas und von Kindern, das der Borgene Gewehen, was hat das groß geboten sich in frischen Toi, das vieles nicht der Gerechte zu dem Himmel, was hat sich dann gelichtigt, also in mild und bläu. Okay, this is it. I just want to introduce it. We don't have a translation for this. It was actually written as a song. It's based on the first line, I don't know what it's called, on the first part of Barhu that we say on, I say we as a well, I'm part of the collective, but not much of about Fila, that people say on high holidays. And it makes sense to feel, it's called, I called it the Simchas Torah lied. And we know that the last Simchas Torah that we had was probably the most awful Simchas Torah that Jews endured. And this Simchas Torah lied was written in Vorkota with the hope for the future. And the meaning of it is, although the times are so bad and the darkness is so thick, we know that somewhere people are clinging their glasses and it will be good, their golden glasses, and things will get well and will persevere. That's the basic idea. Yeah? Hoch mir seinen sehr weit von Freude, even though we are far away from joy, weit from Vergnügen, far away from enjoyment. Lomer Brüder Stilligerheit. Let us, brothers, not silently, but without making too much noise, quietly, sing Sington unser Nigen, sing our song. Simches teure, als es doch gedei, auf der Welt der Größe. Simchat Torah, everything is worthwhile in this great world. In der weiter, sehr weiter frei, das war Weltgröße, in the far, far, far away, klingen gildene Koises. You can hear the golden, what do you call Koises? Yeah, the shot glasses, or Kiddushkat, gildene Koises. Since der Choshech schon so gedicht, es behalten sich die Sterne. The darkness is so thick that even the stars are hiding, or are hidden. But actually active, es behalten sich die Sterne, they're hiding. Es wird sich aber durchbrechen, das Licht. Weit wird nur entwenden. It will, however, the light will, however, break through, and what is far away will become known. Now, we're very lucky because we have a recording of my father singing it, I believe in 1998. He's already quite sick, but he's singing quite well.
Do this every morning to clear stuck mucus from lungs and breathe
Sorry
easy
about
all
this.
day long. Short or weak breathing is easy to blame.
Hoch mir seinen sehr weit vom Fried, weit vom Vergnügen. Lo mir Brüder Stilligerheit, singt dann unser Nigen. Simches teure, als es doch gedeiht, auf der Welt der Größe, in der weiter, sehr weiter frei, klingen gildene Koises, sees der Heuschach schön also Gedicht, es behalten sie die Stern, es wird sich aber durchbrechen das Licht, weit wird Nord werden, Bachkota 53, Jerusalem 93. Simchas Teure, als es doch gedei, auf der Welt der Größe, in der weiter, sehr weiter frei, klingen gildene Koises.
Okay, dear friends, this is about what we wanted to share with you. And this is only a Spitzmesser, of course, but it's much more than many other wonderful poets were blessed with after so many years of them leaving us. So I'm very grateful to you. I'm very grateful to Shane for organizing this meeting. And I'm very, of course, very, very grateful to Maia for her wonderful work. Thank you very much. If you have questions, I don't know if you have questions, I'll be happy to try to answer them.
Herzlichen Dank, Shkoyach Dovber, and congratulations, Maya. Really lovely translations of beautiful poetry. I hope you'll continue. I hope there will be a publisher for your translations of Sutzkever, even if he did use new words. And maybe you'll also take a look at Hulken, as Dober has suggested. And sure, if people have questions or comments, and I'll put a link to buy the book and to read more of Maya's work into the chat. Thank you so much, and thank you to those who attended. Raise your virtual hand and I will unmute you if you have a question or. No questions. We couldn't keep people quiet at the beginning. Good, good. So here's a link to purchase the book so that you can read it in the original Yiddish. Here we have a question from Jessica Carr.
Thank you both so much. I was wondering, actually, since you mentioned that there are no new words, to both of you, but especially to Maia, if you would say something about, as you were translating the Yiddish, but also you both talked about the meter and rhyme and form, but I was wondering if you can say anything about influence of other languages and if that shifted with his identity a bit more, like if you could say a little bit more about like words and their identity as it shifts away from Russian, or does it in the words he's choosing in his poetry, or if you found it difficult to translate into English where it's harder to indicate those influences from other languages.
I don't know if Dober wants to start, but I know that for me as the translator, especially coming from Suits, if people don't know, prior to translating Kerler, I translated quite a bit of Sutzkever. And in Sutzkever, there's quite a lot of influence of other languages. There's, quite a bit of Russian and Hebrew. But I actually found Kerler to be a bit more, I don't want to say pure, but I felt like there was less influence, that it was more Yiddish. There was, I feel like that's not quite fair to Sutzkever, but the fair is laughing. But I found that actually I didn't find so much that it was difficult for me to have to manage other influences or other vocabulary. There was one bit where it was there was one poem that had like a Russian unit of measurements, I think in the poem Dear Land of My Cradle. And that was, but other than that, in terms of vocabulary, that wasn't so much an issue. But as Dovber highlighted, many of these poems are very much in dialogue with Russian poetry. So that is really something that you see, but I wouldn't say that it necessarily went away once he got to Israel. But perhaps Dovber can speak to this better than I can.
Of course, he has many more Russian words or words borrowed from Russia than people outside of Russia, Soviet Union. It's not only him, it's all the writers of the Soviet Union. He may be actually less than most. But the major thing is that really my father was not into minting words, and many poets are. I'm very sad to report even I invent words. And this is sad. But some people think that they have to, so fine. It depends on, it's not bad to invent words, but it's not necessarily something that makes poetry great poetry or higher poetry, whatever. So it's just different attitudes. It's like there is poetry which is easy to understand, and it's still great poetry, and poetry which is very complex and still great poetry too, but it's very complex to understand. So there are different things. I think other than the Russian words like ablavis, like pud, it's it's not, he was writing poetry. Of course, influenced by other texts, he refers to other texts, but I was pleasantly surprised that that Maia almost said that he was pure. He was pure in the sense that he really goes to the language itself. He is the language. He does not have to create. In earlier ages, like Levi, he had to create words. He created the most awful word that we have in English. I mean, a word for most awful thing, which is umkum, which is dreadful. 20 years before Holocaust, he invented umkum, or maybe more even. So that was a different period of literature when language had to be enriched, I guess. He saw himself as the youngest. He was the youngest. He wasn't the youngest. There were people younger than him that wrote Yiddish poetry in the Soviet Union and in America. But at the time, he was the youngest who actually came from the Soviet system. He was the first and last generation of a young poet created by the Soviet system. He went to the kolkhoz and went to the stages. Went to the Yiddish theater school. But I think that's something, again, something that we can see thanks to Maia's translation. That it's a different kind of difficulty rather than, let's say, translate Sutzkever or Levi for that purpose. It's you have to work with the language.
Now that I've said what I said, I remember that there is a poem that I translated where he's playing around with manishma. So yeah, so you definitely do feel the Israeli influence that he's living in Israel in the later poems. And then of course I had to figure out what Valdai bells mean in the earlier poems, and some Ukrainian history with Ivan Gonta and the kobza, the Ukrainian harp. So yes, so you're right. I did notice this.
Very good.
The cultural thing. Yeah.
Let's go to Charles Bonds now with a question.
Charles.
Hi. Thank you very much, Maia, for your translations. I had the privilege of reading a draft in late 2021, and I was very impressed then with reading over the originals and your really excellent translations. And my question is for Dovber about the poem about Ukraine. I'm living in Ukraine, and I'm concerned about the question of perceptions of Jewish history and of the Jewish past in Ukraine on behalf of Ukrainians, and Jewish perceptions of Ukraine. And I'm wondering just if the first poem, right? I mean, it it shows something that we see in history, right? The relationship between love of a place and love of cultures that we're in diaspora in, right? And uh, and outsider insiders in, and the the sort of the both-sidedness of that experience, and then the latter poem, which is reflecting, as you said, Dovber, on the positive things, and really eliminates most of that edge of the original version. And I'm wondering if you can comment at all about any events or any of his perceptions that may have made that sort of enmity go away, that eternal enmity. Where did it go? Right? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think I have an answer for this. When I went to Germany in 2005, in 2010, I believe, and so forth, I was very ambivalent. It was difficult. Before I went last year, a year ago, to teach in Weimar, I had a dreadful dream, right? That I was killed a number of spots in mass murder in Ukraine and Poland and Lithuania. I've never thought that such awful dreams are possible. And that's because I felt very guilty that I'm going to teach in Germany. But when I came to the new Germany, after so many years, and I don't see those old people anymore, they're gone. It's a very different thing. For sure, I remember what happened. And for sure, I'm bitter, but this is a different Germany. This is different people. Right? So I believe this may explain what happened to my father as well. He didn't forget anything. But at the same time, he was longing for his childhood. And it was, when he was saying goodbye to Russia, this poem of Ukraine is part of the series of saying goodbye, because he used to say, I will never have nostalgia because I have nostalgia before I leave, kind of antidote. He said, he wants to remember the good things. And he actually revises it. And I remember I spoke to Suskiva, I think it was 94. And he told me, dein Tate liebt seine Ukraine, liebt seine Ukraine. As if it was a bad thing or not bad thing. It's not clear. And now that I think about it, I think maybe Suskiva could not write in such a way about Lita. Maybe, I don't know. But anyway, Suskiva actually was at the very thick of the murder fields in Vilna. But yeah, my father was of course he used the same words. He knew very well what he wrote in the 50s or 60s, when was it, late 50s or the 60s, Ukraine. And yeah, I think this is, time passes, and you don't want to, different generation. You can't hold children responsible for their parents. I'm not sure they can hold parents responsible for the children, but certainly not children and grandchildren. But it's a different country, different situation. People were not yet alive at the time. So, of course, Gonta is 18th century, right? 1760 something, 1760s. Khalivshina, it's called in Ukrainian historiography. And that's the next, uh, how do you say, not stapel. Next stage, after Bogdan Khmelnytsky, right? So this is the development that happened. First 17th century, then 18th century, then some 19th century, especially 20th. Yeah. I hope it helps to, at least this is how I explained it to myself. I never thought about it. Even though I wrote about it recently, a whole article, but I didn't try to motivate it. For the motivation, I think not from my own experience, I can draw enough motivation to see while my father was seeing it. Well, it chose to see it differently. That was that time, and the 30 years later, you know, of course, he had no idea what will happen with Russia and Ukraine. We didn't. Most people did not believe even a day before it happened, right? So he died in December 2000. I don't think he had any inkling. It's not because it was after. I have no doubt that he would definitely support Ukraine, but I cannot prove it because, as I wrote in the poem a few years ago, I'd love to send them an email, but to ask him different questions, but they haven't invented this kind of email that they can communicate with your dearly departed. Yeah.
All right, I think that might be it for questions. Speaking of, as you wrote in a poem some years ago, you can also follow contemporary Yiddish poets on Facebook if you like to see new work in Yiddish or recent work, and even works by Boris Karloff, the unknown poet. And one more time, Shkoyach Dover, thank you, Maia, and thank you to all of you who turned out.
And also, I just wanted to say thank you to Shane for hosting this. And also, Shane read many drafts of these translations and gave me very valuable insight on various dilemmas that I was having while I was translating this book. So he has helped in many ways.
It's good, interesting poetry and translations to read, and quite musical. So I hope you'll all take the time to read it. Okay.
Thank you to everyone for tuning in.
Thank you very much. Very much who came. Thank you.